Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. There are dual trends taking place in the Middle East, as we've seen with the Iranians and Saudis in an advanced process of improving relations. Arab countries are even improving ties with Syria, reopening embassies, calling for it to rejoin the Arab League. All of that bodes well. It means countries have wisened up and they don't want to be dragged into America's wars. This is all happening at a time when the Americans have made it clear that they want to reduce their so-called engagement in the Middle East to focus on other imperial priorities, such as China and Russia. However, the US-backed Israeli regime continues its semi-covert war against Iran and its allies, conducting acts of sabotage, assassination, and airstrikes routinely in Iran, Syria, and occupied Palestine, for now with seeming impunity. Meanwhile, the occupation of Palestine continues with no end in sight. And this remains the primary issue in the region, as America's client states normalize with Israel, all with the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, which exposes Western hypocrisy and double standards. The US-led fight against resistance to imperialism across the Middle East, from Iraq to Iran, to Syria to Lebanon and Palestine, is responsible for creating the conditions for war, which we saw play out in yet another Israeli bombing campaign against the besieged Gaza Strip. Here to help us understand the state of the resistance in Palestine and beyond, and the shifting regional alliances in the Middle East, is Ali Abunimah, Executive Director of the Electronic Intifada and author of The Battle for Justice in Palestine. Ali, welcome back to the show.
It's always a pleasure, Rania. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for coming back on. I always love having you on. You have so much insight to offer. So let's just jump right into it. Before we get into the latest war in Gaza and maybe other regional issues that we're going to talk about, I'm wondering if we could start with kind of a general big picture idea here. And that is, can you explain to our listeners and viewers why it is that Palestine has been and remains so central to anti-imperialist resistance across the Middle East?
Yeah, and I would say even globally, Palestine remains a central issue in a sense because it is the keystone of American empire in the Middle East and globally. Palestine is, you could say, the last major decolonization project of the 20th century that is unfinished. We saw the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa. We saw the end of all the European colonial regimes throughout Africa, the end of French colonialism in Algeria. And Palestine remains as the last old-fashioned European, guns and jackboots, a settler colony oppressing an indigenous people. And so that struggle remains unfinished. And Israel could not maintain its colonial presence and colonial regime without the support it receives from the United States and Europe. And in the European and American imagination, Israel represents for them, I don't think they would put it this way, but it represents the lost colonial past that they really yearn for. And but they get to talk about it in terms of shared values, Israel representing their shared values of so-called democracy. The reality is Israel is their settler colony in the region, and the defense of Israel and the maintenance of Israel provides a justification for U.S. hegemony and U.S. imperialism in the region, and of course, European as well. The Europeans are really the wagging tail of the American empire, so to speak. But so I think and I think for people around the world, the struggle of Palestinians represents really, it is a David and Goliath story. The Palestinian David, with very few weapons, arrayed against the Israeli Zionist Goliath with its warplanes and its high technology and its missiles. And so for those reasons and many others, Palestine is central. It remains central.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's always important to remember when we talk about this issue, because it is, I appreciate that you put it in that global context as well. But then, of course, like moving to the most recent war on Gaza, Israel, we know, killed, I don't know if this number is still accurate, because I know over, the days after this 3-day bombing campaign, more people have died. But last I saw, it was 47 people in Gaza had been killed in this 3-day assault by the Israelis early this month. At least 16 of them were children. And then, of course, the Israelis went on to like raid the West Bank and kill several people after the so-called ceasefire. But in Gaza, more than 300 Palestinians were injured, something like 15 residential units destroyed or damaged. Islamic Jihad, of course, was the target, the stated target of this latest Israeli campaign. And they responded to Israel's attack with like a barrage of rockets that, of course, caused no deaths at all on the Israeli side. And then a few days later, we saw there was this attack in Jerusalem, which, of course, Israel and the Europeans and the American officials called an act of terrorism. Anything Palestinians do is considered by all of them to be a so-called act of terrorism. And you had said, I saw you tweet this, you said it was this attack in Jerusalem was the direct result of the slaughter of innocent Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. And then you went on to state that the Zionist regime needs to kill Palestinians every day or it will cease to exist. It's as simple as that. And then, of course, we had you on the freedom side recently, which after this, I encourage people to go watch. And you talked a bit about why it is that Israel continues to attack Gaza and why Israel keeps killing Palestinians. But I'm curious if you could maybe reiterate that here, because I don't think it can be emphasized enough. Why is it that Israel seems to have to commit these, almost routine acts of slaughter, not just in Gaza, but also across the West Bank more and more recently?
Yeah, and the numbers of dead from Israel's 3-day bombardment of Gaza just more than a week ago keep going up. It is now 17 children, and I think it's 48 people overall. And this morning, as we're speaking, Israel admitted that 5 children who were killed in Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza were actually killed by Israel. They had, of course, initially claimed that it was a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket that had killed these children. And Israel now admits that they killed the children in that particular incident. But as so often happens, the initial Israeli lie is what reverberates around the world and around the media, and the truth that comes out a week later when what attention was being paid has now gone elsewhere, really never has time to catch up with that lie. And all of this is done, of course, with total impunity and with support from particularly the so-called West. The US and all the European countries defended Israel's slaughter of men, women, and children in Gaza as Israel's so-called right to defend itself, even though Israel launched this surprise, unprovoked assault on Gaza, earlier this month. So when I tweeted Israel has to kill Palestinians or it will cease to exist, I was actually paraphrasing a senior Israeli advisor who spoke those words almost verbatim in 2004. This is advisor to the Israeli government called Arnon Sofer, who was arguing for why Israel had to withdraw its settlements from the interior of Gaza and basically turn Gaza into the caged ghetto that it is now. And the words he spoke, Arnon Sofer, he was an advisor to the Israeli prime minister at the time, Ariel Sharon. He said, we have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day. If we don't kill, we will cease to exist. Those were his words. And what he meant by that is that, Israel has to kill Palestinians constantly, first of all, simply to dominate them and subjugate them, but because for Israel, this is a demographic war. Israeli Jews are a settler colonial minority, the way whites were in South Africa. In South Africa, whites were, 10% of the population, ruling over the other 90% who were black. In Palestine, the numbers are a little more even. The Israeli Jewish population is just under half the population in historic Palestine. But when you include Palestinian refugees who are forcibly expelled and not allowed to return just because they're not Jewish, then Palestinians are an overwhelming majority. So what Sofer was talking about is, we have to, the only way we maintain our position of domination and control is through killing. And he said it quite plainly in those words in an interview in the Jerusalem Post, which I quoted in my first book, One Country, but I've since written about since then. There's an article I wrote a few years ago called "The Gaza Massacre is the Price of a Jewish State." I can't remember if I wrote it in 2014 or 2008 after one of Israel's regular massacres in Gaza, but the point is, it applies every single time Israel does this because the logic is the same. And the logic is that logic which was spelled out so clearly and so plainly by Arnon Sofer. I'll just say one other thing on this, because Israeli leaders are seldom that explicit. They typically use another euphemism that has become common in recent years called mowing the lawn. Talk about every couple of years, just as if you have a yard, every week or 2 weeks, you have to go out and mow the lawn because it gets too long. For them, mowing the lawn in Gaza, you have to do that every year, every 2 years, but they're not cutting grass, they're cutting down men, women, and children. And the idea is twofold. Really, it's to create such horrifying conditions for Palestinians that they will leave. And that's one way of solving the so-called demographic problem. So it's not just the bombing, it's the economic warfare, the 15 years of blockade and siege on Gaza, which are designed to bring the population to the, just to the edge of survival so that they will give up and many of them will emigrate and leave. And the other is this regular killing, which is designed to demoralize and subjugate them so that you destroy any will to resist. Of course, it's had the exact opposite effect, because when you basically create a situation where people have no option but to resist, as Palestinians have no option but to resist, then they put a lot more effort into that resistance. And over the years, despite the Israeli siege, despite the regular massacres, the so-called mowing of the lawn, the Palestinian resistance has become more and more capable, even though it may be much less capable, a tiny fraction of the destructive power that Israel possesses thanks to the United States and the Europeans and others. Nonetheless, Palestinians in Gaza went from having missiles that could barely reach a kilometer or two beyond Gaza's borders to a situation where they have missiles that can reach Tel Aviv, that can shut down, as they have now several times, Ben Gurion International Airport, that could potentially reach other strategic Israeli assets like power plants and oil refineries and so on. So this has all had the opposite effect that Israel wanted. And the only response Israel has is more mowing of the lawn, which means more killing of men, women, and children. And that's why Israel, if it ceases to kill, it ceases to exist.
Well said. And of course, the same applies to the West Bank. Especially recently. I think this year the West Bank really has been the scene of this kind of continuous war of attrition, if you will. The Israelis have been carrying out, daily raids and just constant special operations into Palestinian cities and villages. that, of course, never elicit condemnation from the West. And you guys of Electronic Intifada have covered this very, very well. So, of course, I encourage everybody to become regular followers of Electronic Intifada if you already are not. But, it was under these circumstances of these constant raids that the Palestinian American Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh was murdered by the Israelis, which, of course, the U.S. ended up blaming on Palestinians, even if it was the Israelis that pulled the trigger. All that said, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what's been taking place in the West Bank. And of course, the West Bank has always been the site of these kinds of raids, but does seem to have increased in recent months, perhaps recent years. Why do you think that is?
Right, and you're right. Until even up to this point, even with this recent massacre in Gaza of now close to 50 Palestinians just in the space of a few days, even with that, Israel has killed more Palestinians in the West Bank this year than in Gaza. And of course, last year it was, the turn of Gaza in May 2021. Of course, we talked about that on your show, the massacre that Israel perpetrated in Gaza, another mowing of the lawn. But this year, since January, it's been the West Bank where Israel has killed more Palestinians. Typically, it's one or two a day, 2 or 3 a day. It's not the same. So it to the extent Gaza gets any attention at all, the killings in the West Bank get even less because it is this constant drip of killing, especially of children. Israel has killed now, I think, in the West Bank, it's up to 20 children, Palestinian children this year. Kids just in their towns and villages, going about their business. The most recent they killed was in this Israeli attack on Nablus just a few days ago, where they killed a 16-year-old boy who was just with his father as they were going to work in the morning. And this was in the context of an Israeli attack to carry out an extrajudicial execution of Ibrahim Nabilsi, a Palestinian resistance fighter. So, the issue in the West Bank, I think, there's a couple of them. The West Bank, since the Second Intifada, and particularly since, the Second Intifada was a mass uprising that occurred in the early 2000s. One of the things that the US did, the Bush administration did, was to bring in Mahmoud Abbas in 2005. Actually earlier as a so-called prime minister in the Palestinian Authority, a position that didn't exist before. And that was to disempower Yasser Arafat while he was still alive. Even though Yasser Arafat was doing Israel's bidding under the Oslo Accords and was doing what the Americans wanted, their complaint against him was that he wasn't doing enough. He wasn't obeying orders enough. So they brought in Mahmoud Abbas in 2003, first as prime minister, and later he became head of the Palestinian Authority after Yasser Arafat died or was murdered. I think there's good evidence that he was murdered, but that has been buried too. Al Jazeera Investigations did some really powerful work on that a few years ago. That's all gone down the memory hole on the poisoning of the strong evidence that Arafat was poisoned. But that aside, Abbas's job was to really reorganize the Palestinian Authority to become a very tight, very disciplined proxy force for the United States and Israel. And that's what he did. And so the Palestinian Authority, where were they when Israeli forces raided the old city of Nablus a few days ago and were shooting indiscriminately, killing this child and injuring dozens of civilians? This is supposedly an area under Palestinian Authority control, but instead the Palestinian Authority forces, which are armed and trained by the European Union, the United States, and so on, were nowhere to be seen. They weren't defending Palestinians. They stay in their barracks. They're only there to help Israel, to arrest Palestinians, to torture them, and even to kill them. So the question now is what happens after Mahmoud Abbas, who's in his late 80s and not in good health, disappears from the scene, either if he dies in office or retires. What next? There are not really many people. I mean, there's no one that has any sort of popular base among Palestinians who can fulfill this collaborator role that Mahmoud Abbas has filled. And so I think a lot of what Israel is doing is to try to destroy any centers of Palestinian resistance in the West Bank that could, provide stronger bases for resistance to Israel's occupation and settler colonialism. Once Mahmoud Abbas disappears, and perhaps the edifice of the Palestinian Authority becomes untenable and even collapses. So I think they're thinking ahead to that. I think the plan is to replace Abbas when he goes with another collaborator. And there are a few names that circulate around the Palestinian and Israeli media. But I think that it will be so obvious to every Palestinian that this person is just a puppet put in place, by the guns and money of the United States and Israel and the European Union, that they're not going to be able to rely on that situation to produce the kind of stability that Israel needs to continue stealing Palestinian land and expanding its Jewish-only colonies in the West Bank without, major resistance. So to me, these constant raids and attacks and extrajudicial murders are part of Israel's forward planning for the day after Mahmoud Abbas.
Yeah, that's certainly one way to look at it. And I think, you raise a really good point about the issue of you've mentioned this many times before, but the issue of the Palestinian Authority is the sort of segment of, I guess, Palestinians, whatever, who sort of submitted to the occupation are actually like a part of it at this point, right? Like they actually collaborate with the Israeli occupation. Yet, despite that,
I mean, Mahmoud Abbas called it, the euphemism that's used is security coordination.
Right.
That's the euphemism. And Mahmoud Abbas said it openly a few years ago that security coordination with Israel is, the word he used in Arabic is muqaddas, which means sacred. That no matter what Israel does, no matter what how bad relations get between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, because they're always trading rhetoric with each other and accusing each other of things. You go on, you find all sorts of official statements every day from senior Palestinian Authority officials. For example, after Shireen Abu Akleh was murdered, they were furious. They accused Israel of all sorts of crimes. But behind the scenes and behind that rhetoric, the sacred security collaboration, security coordination continues without interruption. Well,
it also just shows that no matter how much Palestinians a Palestinian government, if you will, submits to the Israeli occupation, there will always be Israeli violence, because of course the Israelis try to frame it as that they're just reacting, right? They're always reacting to attacks and terrorism. And I want to bring up the issue of armed resistance here, which we've also talked about in the past, but I think we're sort of in a special moment for a couple reasons. One is, of course, because armed resistance is now cool, right? If certain people do it. And of course, here I'm talking about Ukraine.
Well, that's only if you have blonde hair and blue eyes.
Right. Armed resistance is very cool and worth celebrating if you have blonde hair and blue eyes. I want to actually show an example of this because it's quite stunning. Here is a recent New York Times article actually celebrating these, I guess, drones that the Ukrainians have built. And have managed to or drones the Ukrainians have kind of added to, they've added grenades to. And, the New York Times here is just really amazed and happy about the ingenuity of Ukrainians, right? And adding grenades to drones. And I actually, the reason I even saw this article is because I saw you tweet it out and you were pointing out, well, Palestinians literally build their own drones from scratch. And never once has the New York Times and they've done this under siege. Never once has the New York Times written an article praising their ingenuity, you know?
And of course,
Quite the
Hezbollah and
opposite.
Lebanon too, as
Yes.
well. I mean, if we want to look at these things strictly in terms of the ingenuity and the creativity and the technical achievements of groups that are, under sanctions and blockade and all sorts of things, and don't get the kind of help that Ukraine gets, then the achievements of Hezbollah engineers and Lebanese resistance engineers and Palestinian resistance engineers are, of course, even more worthy of celebration in the New York Times. But of course, as we know, it's not what you do, it's who you are and who your enemy is, and who's supporting you. And there was another thing in the New York Times, I also tweeted it, that I think yesterday, about how, it was just sort of casual and passing, no sense of condemnation at all, about how the Ukrainians have been killing collaborators using car bombs and poison in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. Like, so, okay, now car bombs and poison are cool, So again, it's like, very eye-opening. We learned that, again, it reaffirms it's not what you do, it's who you are that matters to the so-called West.
Absolutely. And of course, like this, back when the war was more in its beginning phases, like every media outlet was not just, I think there was like a guide. Who was it? The BBC or maybe like Sky News that published a guide to building Molotov cocktails.
Yeah. And there was another one about like where to aim your weapons, like what are the vulnerable parts of, Russian armored vehicles, where you should you throw your Molotov cocktail for maximum effect.
It's really incredible.
Incredible stuff. Incredible stuff.
Well, so that's like one unique aspect of this is that, the recent escalation against Palestinians in Gaza was taking place in the backdrop of this war in Ukraine, when all of these Western officials are like praising Ukrainian resistance and all these media outlets are praising Ukrainian resistance. And then this is an actual occupation that's been going on for 70 years. And the opposite happens where we stand by Israel's right to like slaughter Palestinian children. So that's one side of it. And the other side of it is, the day after the ceasefire was reached with Gaza, Israel killed several Palestinians in that assault on Nablus that you mentioned. And of course, the target of that killing was a resistance fighter, Brahim al-Nabulsi. And he was a member of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. And he was an interesting figure because the Israelis had tried to kill him in the past, but he managed to evade like several assassination attempts. And then in his, sort of last ditch effort to fight till the end, because the Israelis were like bombing his house basically to kill him, he recorded a farewell message. And in his final moments, one thing that he said was he told Palestinians to keep fighting and to never put down their weapons. And it was quite a powerful thing to say, I think. And the reason I raise that is because I think, and you sort of alluded to this earlier, this is maybe at this point in time, like I don't think there's ever existed such an organized armed resistance to the Israelis. And of course, just Palestine alone, whether we're talking about resistance fighters in the West Bank or in Gaza, who are always coordinating with each other, but it kind of goes beyond that as well, because you have this kind of regional resistance that is, all on the same side as the U.S. likes to, as they like to call themselves, the axis of resistance. From Tehran to Beirut, really with the support of Iran, you have Hezbollah in Lebanon. You have certain elements of the Iraqis that call themselves resistance. You have the Syrians, and then of course you have the Palestinians. And so I'm just curious if you have anything to say about that, the fact that it is pretty significant, like the level of coordination and organization that we see in terms of resistance, particularly in Palestine, but perhaps beyond. And then just to add to that, can you maybe also walk our listeners and viewers who aren't aware through the fact that Palestinians actually do have a right to armed resistance that, of course, Western officials never recognize, but they have that right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, So actually, Ibrahim Nabilsi is a good place to start with that. This is a young man, in his early 20s. And of course, Israel had been trying to capture him or kill him for a year, and they finally did kill him in Nablus in really a cowardly way. They surrounded him in a house where he was with another comrade, Islam Sabur, and they fired anti-tank missiles into the house. But when this was happening, and of course they were firing, as I mentioned, indiscriminately in this densely populated old city of Nablus, injuring 70 people with live ammunition, just people going about their business. And this has gone, I mean, you can imagine if a gunman walked into the middle of, in fact, the attack in Jerusalem the other day in which 7 people were injured got global attention. The Israeli attack, killing a child and injuring dozens of people, 10 times more people than in Jerusalem, got no mention. The attack that occurred in Nablus. Nonetheless, the target of that attack was Ibrahim Nabilsi. Even the Israeli media were saying that the Israeli army accuses him of a series of shooting attacks against Israeli soldiers. So they call him a terrorist because Israel calls everyone a terrorist. But then they were not even accusing him of firing on Israeli civilians. I didn't see in the Israeli media claims saying that Ibrahim Nabilsi had been attacking civilians. It said the Israeli army accuses him of firing at Israeli soldiers. So he was a resistance fighter by any standard, that nobody can argue with that. And yet we don't see European Union officials celebrating him or condemning his killing or encouraging their citizens, like we see them encouraging British and Dutch and Americans to go to Ukraine and fight on behalf of the Ukrainians. We don't see them saying, go and fight in Palestine like Ibrahim Nabilsi was doing against the Israeli army. So that just really highlights for me just the sheer double standard and the racism involved. But Palestinians do have a right to resist under international law. They're under military occupation. That right is inherent in something called customary international law. And there are a number of UN resolutions dating back many years, General Assembly resolutions. I don't remember the numbers of them now, but they reaffirm the right of colonized and occupied people to resist by any means, to liberate themselves. And, there's, in the context of what happened in Gaza, I think this is important to say, because it goes in a direction I haven't seen discussed, but I think we have to have this discussion. Now, Gaza is completely besieged by land, sea, and air, and Palestinians there are under constant attack. Remember, the attack that Israel launched, like so many of its attacks, was unprovoked. And the siege is economic warfare against every man, woman, and child in Gaza, night and day, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year for 15 years. It's lethal. Israel kills people with this siege because one of the aspects of it is that they deny or delay permission for Palestinians to leave Gaza to get life-saving medical care for cancer and other conditions routinely. And in 1 year alone, a few years ago, where I wrote about those numbers, at least 50 Palestinians were killed in Gaza because they were denied permission by Israel to leave for life-saving treatment that they can't get in Gaza because the Israeli siege and constant wars have also destroyed the healthcare system there. So the question is, if Palestinians have a right to resist, then how can they resist? We see constantly, even human rights organizations saying that, maybe Palestinians have a right to resist, but indiscriminate rocket fire is a war crime. and Palestinian Amnesty International even put out a tweet. Amnesty MENA, the Middle East North Africa office, called for an international arms embargo on Israel and the Palestinian resistance, as if, anyone is supplying, except Iran, we'll get to that, arms to the Palestinian resistance. They're all supplying it to Israel. But it's, to me, completely immoral to call for an arms embargo on people who are resisting an occupation that is killing them and destroying them mercilessly. Palestinians have a right to resist. Now, in terms of the so-called indiscriminate rocket fire, I've made the argument. I made it in a Twitter thread, which is sometimes, what you do. You test out ideas before you put them in an article. But I put some tweets out about this, that the so-called indiscriminate rocket fire can't be illegal because international law says, indiscriminate weapons are illegal. Okay, fine. In principle, I would agree with that. But let's consider that Palestinians in Gaza don't have the high precision guidance systems that Israel has, that Israel is given by the United States and the Europeans and others. So what you're saying is if they can't use unguided rockets, then they effectively have no means to resist and they can simply allow Israel to slaughter them. And that cannot be the result of international law. I argue that there is something in the law. There's a common law principle that's recognized in many countries called the doctrine of necessity, which was summed up by some legal scholar in the 17th or 18th century that sums it up this way: that which is unlawful becomes, or let me try to get it right. That which is usually unlawful becomes lawful by necessity. And that principle simply means that sometimes, for example, self-defense, it is generally, and this is a good thing, unlawful to kill a fellow human being, but it becomes lawful if that's the only way to protect your life or the life of someone else. And then there's a question of proportionality. The rockets that Palestinians are using have killed Israelis or have killed people in Israel, but in mercifully very small numbers. And as we saw in the recent escalation started by Israel, there were no serious injuries and no deaths. So they are also proportionate to the much greater threat and danger that they are being used against. And that's another idea that's contained in the doctrine of necessity, that you can use force to defend yourself, but it has to be the minimum necessary force. If you fend someone off and stop them from attacking you, that's lawful. You're not allowed to chase after them after the danger has passed and just shoot them down. That becomes unlawful. That becomes murder. And so I think there's an argument to be made that it's perverse to say that, only high-tech countries with precision weapons have a right to resist or to self-defense. That can't be right. And so, if you don't want to A, stop giving Israel high-tech weapons to murder Palestinians, and B, don't want to give Palestinians high-tech precision weapons to defend themselves, then you're in no position to complain about the means that Palestinians use.
Right.
I think that's just common sense. So, I say enough of that, enough of these hypocritical double standards. And the final thing I'll say on this about indiscriminate weapons is that Israel supposedly has these high-tech precision-guided weapons and uses them to target civilians, to make sure they hit the civilians and that they don't miss the civilians. And this is a doctrine that Israel calls the Dahya doctrine, which, as you'll know, Rania, is named after the Dahya, the southern suburb of Beirut, which Israel in 2006 deliberately destroyed, killing civilians, destroying civilian infrastructure because they couldn't, because Israel had no way to stop the prowess of the Lebanese military resistance. And the same in Gaza. They deliberately target office buildings, infrastructure, residential buildings, because they can't stop the guerrilla resistance. So, and yet the so-called West, which thinks that these rockets from Gaza are to be condemned and to be considered war crimes, are fine with Israel doing that. Mm-hmm. But Israel also uses indiscriminate weapons in the form of artillery. I wrote about this last year after the May 2021 attack. Artillery, in the context of heavily, densely populated areas like Gaza, is inherently indiscriminate. Right. Artillery shells are, ballistic objects. They fly up on a ballistic trajectory and they come down. And even the most accurate artillery has a range of, whether it's 100 meters or 200 meters, depending on what it is, of probability where that projectile is going to land. But if you're talking about somewhere like Shuja'iyya, the eastern neighborhood of Gaza, which is densely populated and which was destroyed by Israeli artillery in 2014, a radius of 50 meters or 100 meters means you're going to take out whole apartment buildings. It's inherently indiscriminate. So I wanted to use this opportunity to put that argument out there, that even the so-called human rights groups need to grapple with the reality that you cannot have standards of international law that leave a people defenseless against an aggressor and occupier like Israel, which is armed by superpowers. Human rights standards, international law standards cannot lead to a situation where defending yourself with the means you have becomes a crime.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a really good point, because also, I mean, at the end of the day, who writes international law, right? It's those who are powerful. Who does it apply to? It only applies to the weak. It never applies to the powerful. Look at who's been sent to The Hague. Have we ever seen an American or an Israeli war criminal, which there are plenty to choose from? No, That's never happened.
Exactly. And that's what I say to all those countries and governments that are complaining that Palestinians are using so-called indiscriminate weapons. Either you stop sending weapons to Israel, which would be the best outcome, because no war, no fighting, no violence. Stop sending weapons to Israel. If you don't want to do that, then give Palestinians the means to defend themselves. Right. You're sending all these javelins and missiles and HIMARS and everything to Ukraine. Give Palestinians the high precision HIMARS artillery so that they can take out the Hakiria, the defense ministry complex in the heart of Tel Aviv. Help Palestinians destroy Hakiria, where massacres of Palestinians are planned, where the occupation is planned. Help Palestinians to take out Israeli military bases and training sites with precision weapons. Let's see all these clever Europeans send their high precision German and American and French artillery to Gaza so Palestinians can use it to precisely target those who are attacking and occupying them. And then you won't have to complain about indiscriminate rockets. But if you're not prepared to do that, just please shut up.
And also, I'll just point out that their superior weaponry is made using precious metals that are like looted from the third world to begin with, but it's just one big cycle. It's horrible.
The whole arms industry is just an atrocity against humanity. But the hypocrisy of these people who are exporting, I mean, the European countries and the United States, who are responsible for the vast majority of the world's arms trade, lecturing people in a ghetto, the vast majority of whom are refugees, ethnically cleansed from their land, calling them criminals for defending themselves against a country that has engaged in ethnic cleansing and massacres and murder for decades. It's just, enough of it. I'm just not willing to take it from them.
And of course, I think that you made a really good point recently on the freedom side. In fact, you said Israel can't bomb its way to legitimacy. And I think that 70 years of trying to do that, and despite that, there's still being a pretty well-armed and organized resistance that manages to create certain levels of deterrence of different varieties across the region to Israel.
Yeah, and that's thanks to we talked about the ingenuity of Palestinian and Lebanese engineers who, obviously very capable. But it's also thanks to Iran, because, Palestinian resistance groups have acknowledged that Iran is it's the only country that they've acknowledged publicly and thanked for assisting their military resistance. And I say, and you'll get these sort of people in the Arab world, the right-wing, pro-American people say, Iran arms and funds groups across the region. First of all, Palestinians have a right to resist. Secondly, if no one else is giving them weapons, why shouldn't they take them from Iran? If you don't want them to take weapons from Iran, let Saudi Arabia send weapons to the Palestinian resistance. I'm pretty sure that they would accept it as long as they're entitled to use the weapons for resistance. Let Qatar send weapons. Jordan send weapons. Let all these countries that are complaining that Iran is gaining influence because it's supporting resistance, let them put their money where their mouth is. But of course they don't. They don't want Palestinians to resist. They don't want anyone else to resist. They don't want Lebanese to resist. They want Lebanon to be handed over on a silver tray to Israel and to its proxies in the region. That's what they want. They don't want Lebanon to resist. And I always say, and I'm convinced of it, that had there been no military resistance in Lebanon that was capable of defeating and deterring Israel, as they have done several times, there would be Israeli settlers 40, 50 kilometers inside Lebanon, telling us all about how the Bible gave them this land. The only reason they're not doing that is because of the resistance.
No, absolutely. I mean, Israel had a brutal occupation of southern Lebanon, and the only reason they weren't able to move settlers there is because of the existence of Hezbollah, and the only reason they're no longer there is because of Hezbollah. And that's actually a good segue into the issue of course, this maritime border conflict between the Lebanese and the Israelis. Of course, just for some background, I think that, Ali, that Israel in its latest war on Gaza was also to some degree sending a message to Hezbollah. Its leaders said as much, right? Like every day Israel threatens to unleash a war on Lebanon over Hezbollah's existence, but it hasn't done so because of Hezbollah's existence. There hasn't been a war on Lebanon by the Israelis since 2006, when Hezbollah once again pushed the Israelis out. And it was one of the only times that anything close to resembling an Arab army, you could say, managed to defeat the Israelis and push them off their land. However, tensions in Lebanon right now are very high over this maritime border dispute. There's, of course, these gas fields, these offshore gas fields in the Mediterranean that the Israelis are claiming all of it for themselves. And unfortunately, Lebanon has a very weak and inept government, and which the Israelis are trying to take advantage of. And there's a lot of reasons why that government is weak. The Americans, the Saudis are partly responsible for that. But the point is the government isn't really in a position to make demands. Half of the Lebanese government would be fine just giving it away to Israel, these offshore gas fields. Lebanon has this horrible economic crisis and actually needs this resource, not just for some level of revenue for the country, but also it could be very useful in helping alleviate this horrible electricity crisis in Lebanon, where people are getting about 1 to 2 hours of state electricity a day. So at some point, the Americans have appointed a mediator to mediate these negotiations. That mediator's name is Amos Hochstein. He happens to be not just American, but also Israeli. He was born in Israel. He served in the Israeli army, which of course seems like a huge conflict of interest. And this is the person that's supposedly mediating, right, between Israel and Lebanon. And of course is basically just Israel's lawyer here, demanding whatever the Israelis want, which again is all of this maritime area, the parts, including the parts that belong to Lebanon. And of course, Hezbollah, as it often does when the government is too weak and ineffective to protect the country, has stepped in. And Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader, has repeatedly warned that, look, like this is Lebanon's resource, this is Lebanon's wealth. If the Israelis start drilling before negotiations are complete, and if Lebanon gets a bad deal, like we will go to war over this. We will go to war over something that belongs to Lebanon. And so anyways, all of that's to say that there's people who are hopeful there'll be some like fair negotiation, but people in Lebanon are very concerned that there could be a war over this. I'm just curious, giving that background, what are your thoughts as we watch Israel? Israel's already stolen offshore gas fields from Palestinians, so it wouldn't be new for Israel to do this. But of course, Israel's always claiming everything as its own. The Israelis, from their end, have this, wild fantasy of if they can just drill in these offshore gas fields, they can become Europe's new offshore gas or a new gas client to replace the Russians. So anyways, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this latest dispute that could very, very easily turn into or escalate into a war?
Yeah, I think this is one of the issues that to which there's been too little attention in terms of how dangerous it is, because from what I understand, and it's magnified by the European desperation to find other sources of gas than Russia. And so Europe is looking to Israel and to the whole Eastern Mediterranean region. And so there's, as usual, the Americans and the Europeans are fully behind Israel on this issue and in a hurry to get, that gas flowing. And the company, it's a Greek company that has been given the contract by Israel to begin drilling in September in this so-called Karish field that is in the disputed waters between Lebanon and Israel. And in June, a couple of months ago, the Greek company Energean moved its rig into the waters, into the Karish field, which prompted another warning prompted several warnings from Nasrallah about, if Israel starts drilling. And the firm has announced that it's going to start drilling in September. So that provides a very imminent, let's say, deadline for this to all escalate in a potentially catastrophic manner. And Lebanon and Israel have, in a sense, created a kind of non-nuclear deterrence, a form of non-nuclear mutually assured destruction. Almost every day or every week in the Israeli press, you can find statements by senior Israeli officials or generals saying, what they'll do to Lebanon. And it's another version of what they did or tried to do in 2006, bombing bridges, bombing infrastructure, bombing power plants, basically destroying the country, the Dahya doctrine over the whole country. And nobody in Lebanon has any doubt about Israel's ability to do that. The new factor, or let's say the untested factor here, is what is Hezbollah's ability to do that to Israel. In 2006, Hezbollah dealt very severe military blows to Israel, defeating Israeli soldiers in combat on the battlefield in southern Lebanon. Israeli soldiers were fleeing, abandoning their tanks and fleeing, because the myth of the Israeli army, Rania, is that, it's this, amazing army that, is just second to none in the world. This is BS. The Israeli soldiers haven't had real combat experience for decades, if ever. All they do is shoot kids in the West Bank, and bomb Gaza from, F-16 fighter jets. Where have Israeli soldiers actually engaged in real battle in any kind of evenly matched context? In Lebanon in 2006, where they weren't evenly matched, where Israel presumably had much better equipment and resources, Hezbollah beat them, and it was a humiliation. And since 2006, Hezbollah is reported to have developed a massive, an even bigger missile deterrent that could reach any part of Israel, and in such a volume that it would likely overwhelm any missile defense systems Israel has in place. And so nobody really knows what Hezbollah could do in that context, but the Israeli assessment has to be that this is a risk we would prefer to avoid if we can, because the potential here is that, yes, Israel can destroy Lebanon as it has before, but for the first time, potentially, Hezbollah would be able to pay Israel back in something that is roughly comparable. That, at least, is the fear that the Israelis have, and it's certainly the fear that Hezbollah wants to instill in the Israelis. And, it's sort of the big question mark. But there is a very real danger that this scenario could become real, and with horrific consequences. So the maritime dispute, it's clear that Israel is desperate for an agreement with Lebanon for a number of reasons. One is because it would create a precedent of negotiations with Lebanon, which Israel would want to then pursue in terms of like trying to bring Lebanon into the camp of normalization with Israel. That's the long-term, Israeli dream for sure about Lebanon. They've tried it before. But the other is that they're desperate to bring this gas online and become Europe's alternative. And the mere threat of Hezbollah's military capability is a problem, because you've got firms like Greek firms and international firms. Israel doesn't have the capability. Israel doesn't have gas rigs and that drilling capability itself. That all has to be done by international firms. And so if you're bringing in international firms for this kind of thing, you need insurance, you need international staff to come, you need all that. And that's very hard to get if in a situation that looks like it could blow up at any time. So that's a huge card in the hand of Lebanon, in that it effectively holds a veto over Israel's ability to drill in these waters. And it's not a card that anyone in Lebanon should want to give up easily or quickly.
Exactly. What do we know is that capital is a coward. So, like you mentioned, these international companies. I think that there was a time. I think last year there was, I can't remember which company it was. It was like Chevron, maybe, that actually halted operations because of the war in Gaza. And it was like halting operations near rockets that I don't think could even reach it. And Hezbollah actually they made a video for the Israelis, showing video surveillance footage of Israeli rigs on Israeli gas fields, or stolen Palestinian gas fields, showing in areas that Lebanon isn't even claiming as belonging to Lebanon, but essentially saying, look, if you guys start drilling in what we see as our waters, like, we will make it impossible for you to even drill in what's considered your waters, like officially now. That said, I wanted to, there's a few last things I wanted to ask you about that are, tangentially related to everything else that we're talking about. One is, I think I have to bring this up because it's been in the news so much, and that is, of course, the novelist Salman Rushdie was brutally attacked, and this elicited, some unfortunate reactions to that attack. As I saw it, it was kind of like this one lone loser stabbing a guy, not even killing him, right? And there was just the reactions were these kinds of like, there was the, Israeli officials, some responded trying to connect it to their fight against Palestinians, as they usually do whenever anyone does anything supposedly in the name of Islam. I'm not even sure like yet if this guy's, made a point about why he did this or not. He may have. I wasn't really following the details. And then there was reactions like this. This is not necessarily to like pick on her, but I wanted to show this tweet because I think it kind of encapsulates everything that was wrong by the reactions. Here is Tulsi Gabbard saying, Islamist ideology, which is not the same as Islam, the religion, is what inspired jihadists to declare war on America on 9/11. And on Friday, drove a man to attempt to murder Salman Rushdie for blasphemy. Its terrorism offspring is the greatest threat to our country and the world. And the reason I wanted to show this is because it was a common attitude I saw. And, it just seems, first of all, like the war on terror is so like last decade, right? But also like there's no need to return to the 2000s, let alone like the 1980s. Islamophobia and the war on terror, all this stuff, because one crazy guy tries to kill an old novelist. Like people get murdered all the time for any number of reasons. And then there's also the issue, I mean, of course, like nobody deserves to be hurt over what they've written in a novel. I absolutely like disagree with that mentality. That said, like this guy is a very provocative man who kind of made his living off of being provocative and controversial and like used it to his benefit as well. I mean, there's a lot to say about this. I'm just curious to get your reaction, particularly because of some of the people who were making statements turning in this not just a reason to be Islamophobic, but also like with Israeli officials trying to use this to support their own narrative.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about this, so I'll try and sum up my thoughts. I mean, first of all, the attack, this goes without saying, but if you try to have any sort of complex conversation about this, people will accuse you of supporting the attack. It goes without saying. The attack on Salman Rushdie is horrific and unjustifiable. And, I'm very glad he wasn't killed, and I hope he makes a recovery. And we don't know, we don't know what the motives were of the person who attacked him. He hasn't made any statement publicly that we know of. The only thing that's known about him is his name and that he's from New Jersey. But there is a context to this, of course, which is that Salman Rushdie was threatened for many years because of the book he wrote, The Satanic Verses, in 1988, which I actually read as a teenager. And when all this came out, I'm old enough to remember the whole Salman Rushdie controversy from that time. And in a sense, it was the prototype. I don't think we knew it at the time. I didn't. I wasn't particularly sophisticated politically, but it was the prototype for what we saw later in terms of these sorts of blaming of Islam and Muslims for so much that was wrong in the world. The so-called fatwa against Salman Rushdie came from Khomeini in Iran, revolutionary Iran, in 1989, at the end of just after the Iran-Iraq war, in which the West, the Americans, the French, the Germans, the British had armed and supported Iraq for 8 years to wage war in Iran. Iraq, at the behest of the West, invaded Iran in 1979 or 1980. And that was a horrific and brutal war that killed so many people and involved chemical weapons supplied by Germany and France and other countries. Horrible stuff. That was the context for Khomeini's fatwa. And Rushdie became the prototype, sort of his novel, which was seen as very denigrating to Islam and to Muslims, became, that was the first round of what we saw later with the so-called Muhammad cartoons, where, just gratuitously insulting and provoking whole populations who have already been the targets of brutal and genocidal colonial violence for decades, if not centuries, becomes the symbol and badge of free speech and courage. Where is the courage in that? Where is the courage in attacking and denigrating the religion of these populations? And I heard, I was on a road trip in recent days, so I had a lot of time to listen to the BBC and the CBC and NPR and all the other stations that you can get on the satellite radio in the car. And I can't tell you how many times Salman Rushdie was lauded for, as a brave, courageous voice and for speaking truth to power. But that's not what Salman Rushdie did at all. He was a mouthpiece for power. And one thing I can never forget is a disgusting, disgusting op-ed he wrote in The Guardian in 2002, arguing for the invasion of Iraq. This is a really horrible piece, which was designed to bring so-called anti-war liberals onto the pro-war bandwagon. And so I wish Salman Rushdie the speedy recovery that the victims of the war of aggression that he supported in Iraq will never have. The attack on Salman Rushdie is totally unjustified. It's a crime. No one should be subjected to that. But let's not claim that Salman Rushdie is some brave spokesperson for the downtrodden. He was someone who was adopted by the West and by the powerful because he was willing to use his ethnicity and to weaponize his ethnicity and his religious background or ancestry as a Muslim in order to attack Muslims and justify the so-called war on terror and wars that killed and destroyed countless lives.
No, indeed. I couldn't have said it better. I think there's definitely something to be said about the way that the West does make heroes out of these figures who basically, they prop up like white supremacy and like imperialism.
Yeah.
And then they become,
they're native informants, they're the brown person or the Muslim person. There were so many of them. There's a whole cottage industry of them after 9/11. The native informants who can come and say, well, I am a Muslim, so I can tell you how horrible the Muslims are. Or I'm an ex-Muslim, so I can tell you, about the truth. They validate the racism and the anti-Muslim bigotry that is not just, about, it's that is the basis for, murderous and genocidal wars and economic warfare against entire countries. And that's all that context is missing from the discussion about Salman Rushdie, who is now the new whose credentials as a hero of free speech and bravery have been renewed by this horrible attack. He doesn't deserve to be the victim of this attack, but he's no hero and no courageous voice in my book.
Well, I also just there's one last thing I need to raise before we wrap here, and that is, Ali, it's been, I think, like 15 years, if my math is correct, since you wrote, I'm going to pull it up right now, this very prescient article. This is about how Barack Obama learned to love Israel. And I have to give my colleague Eugene Purrier a shout out for raising this. He was like, you're going to have Ali on. You got to ask him about the Edward Said photo.
Yeah.
And here's the photo that he was referring to. This is a photo of Barack Obama at a table with Edward Said. You wrote this piece back in 2007. So it was like when Obama was just starting his run for president. And he was viewed back then because of this photo, actually. And I think he had like a bit of a friendship with like Rashid Khalidi. he was viewed as somebody who would, be good to Palestine, right? Who would be good on the Middle East. And of course, for those people who believe that, he was a huge disappointment. But you were warning back in 2007 about Barack Obama's corporate history, how he wasn't really ever against any wars. He just kind of got that reputation because he wasn't around to vote for the Iraq War. And you were warning people against getting deluded by the fact that he may have sat down and been in a photo with Edward Said this one time, to think that he would be good. At the end of the day, he's still going to be, if he wins, president of an imperial country, and he has all the views that come with that. And the reason I raise this is because I'm wondering, Ali, do you think that progressives have learned their lesson from this, episode of somebody kind of pretending to be a progressive, maybe pretending to, or letting people think they might be supportive of Palestine and against war, and then turning out to be the exact opposite?
Oh, well, yeah, I haven't looked at this photo for a few years, but, Obama, I'll just say about Obama is that, and the context of this photo, as you can see the caption there, it was in 1998 at an event that I attended in the Arab community. And he was, he would come to events from time to time. He met with groups of us privately from time to time and talked about different things. And he would sort of express, at the time, it was so unusual for any politician to pay any attention to the community at all, that you could sort of exaggerate how good he was. I'm sure that at the time I thought, oh, wow, Barack Obama is great. But by the time I wrote this article, and actually before, but, this article in 2007 was me kind of really laying it all out, I recognized that this was a scam, this was a fraud, that this was just a politician really climbing the ladder, and he didn't care who he had to step over. And everything I said in that article in 2007, sadly turned out to be prescient. That this was a man who would do whatever it took to get to power, and he would, crush whoever was below him and never look back. Really, truly psychopathic behavior. But the sort of aesthetics of, a man whose father was African, whose middle name is Hussein, who sort of speaks a social justice language, and who here is pictured with Edward Said, was enough just to dazzle people. And unfortunately, one difference is we really didn't have social media the same way then. I think we barely had it at all. I don't think I joined Twitter until 2008, and even then it was much, much fewer people. But now, at least judging from social media, I think there is a generation of people who are not just willing to accept this kind of aesthetics of progressivism or aesthetics of radicalism, who really do care about substance. But I don't know how prevalent that is. Certainly the Democratic Party still completely weaponizes identity in order to kind of neutralize any kind of radical alternative and to co-opt people. But, is it going to work? Can they just kind of do the making history thing with Kamala Harris, or making history with Pete Buttigieg? That still obviously works with a large segment of the population, but maybe there's something optimistic in that I do think there is kind of a young, much more radical generation out there that says, we don't care who the messenger is. We care about the message. Are you going to change the fundamentals of this society and this economy to make it fair, to make it, to bring real economic democracy? And that is the right question that people need to be asking. And look at Obama today. He lived, the reason I did meet him quite a few times in the late 90s and early 2000s is partly because we lived in the same neighborhood. in Chicago. He left that neighborhood when he went to Washington in 2004 to become senator. Almost never came back. He still keeps a house there, but he spent very little time in Chicago. But he came back in a big way to build his so-called Obama Foundation, or the Obama Presidential Center, in the most Obama-like way you can imagine. In a corrupt deal organized by Rahm Emanuel, who was mayor of Chicago at the time. But remember, Rahm Emanuel was his first chief of staff in the White House. Obama was given a huge piece of historic Jackson Park, a beautiful South Side Park that is one of the original parks laid out for the plan of Chicago, in a corrupt deal where he was given a 99-year lease for $10 of public trust land that is never supposed to be privatized, to build his presidential center that is not a real presidential library. It's not under the jurisdiction of the National Archives. So it is really just a private, essentially profit-making project for Obama, just to his ego. They cut down hundreds of very mature trees in this beautiful park, and they're putting up this empty monument to Obama. They're going to put up this glass bird killing tower, I call it. And every time I go down there now, and you just see the open sky where there used to be these trees, it's just horrible. And they steamrolled over all of the neighborhood opposition to this, because there was justified fear that the Obama coming into the neighborhood in this way will do what Bill Clinton did to Harlem, which is just gentrify it and price the stable, low-income Black communities out of the neighborhood. And that's already happening. And they just steamrolled over the resistance. They smeared them in the media. They said, oh, these people aren't really representative. They did this total AstroTurf campaign, well-funded AstroTurf campaign, where you saw in windows, and actually at bus shelters, they put up ads and things saying, we support the Obama Center, in order to steamroll all local resistance. And this is a guy who was always talking about empowerment and, we got to get folks empowered, and we got to get folks to do this and folks to do that. And he just steamrolled over the folks in Chicago to build this horrible monument to himself and his killer drones. From beginning to end, this is who Barack Obama has been. And I really hope that people learn the lesson and will not have the wool pulled over their eyes again by these fake progressives and fake radicals, and just allow the Democratic Party to keep doing this to them.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Ali, I want to thank you as always. I love having you on. You're one of our favorite return guests, so I really appreciate you breaking everything down. Can you remind people where to follow you and the work of Electronic Intifada?
Yes, thank you, Rania. It's always my pleasure, and you give me a chance to air some of my, these things that I spend the day stewing about quietly. So I hope it's a useful discussion to people. But you can find my work and the work of my fantastic colleagues at the Electronic Intifada, electronicintifada.net, or just search for us. I am on Twitter. It's the main place where I rant, if you want to call it that, at Ali Abunimah. Maybe you can put that up on the screen too. But thanks again. And Rania, let me just say that I love your show. I'm not saying this just to be a fan. Honestly, when there is a new episode, the kind of guests you get on to talk in depth about so many of the contemporary issues and crises, I learn so much from them. I go on to read some of the stuff they're writing. I've learned so much, and there is so little of this out there. So just please keep doing it, Rania. It's great stuff.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest breakthrough news content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthrough news.